Our topic is sex dolls, artificial intelligence, and the real thing. Now that a new generation, high-tech generation of sex robots is upon us, the jokes are reappearing and becoming more intensified. A wife says, "Oh, I don't need one of those since my husband is already robotic in bed." Ha ha. "Sure," her husband replies, "but you should see my wife in action." Amusing wordplay, but sad. Another joke connected with our fears of sexual rejection. Sex dolls are now so realistic that they only want to be friends with you. Now, the reality is that the next generation of sex robots promises to overcome the weakness of current and past sex dolls. That is, the current and past generation sex dolls do not really simulate very well the physical sensations of sex, and also they cannot simulate the psychological features of sex. But newly engineered materials and robotics have made the physical experiences much closer to the real thing. And artificial intelligence has enabled and is increasingly enabling the robots to respond verbally and non-verbally more realistically. Perhaps robots will soon be able to pass sex and romance Turing tests. A Turing test named for, of course, Alan Turing, one of the great geniuses in the early days of artificial intelligence. But Turing was asking the question, well, how would we really know when an artificial computer is actually intelligent instead of merely simulating intelligence? And his answer was to do a blind question and answer session where a human being is asking any questions he or she wants, and if after a certain number of questions, listening to the answers, the human can't tell the difference between an actual human response and the machine response, then we'll consider that an actually intelligent being. So, suppose we get robots to the point where the physical experience of interacting with them is indistinguishable, and the psychological interaction with them, because of high generation artificial intelligence, also seems to be indistinguishable. What are the big fears that this whole area seems to be generating and does in fact generate? Of course, there are lots of knee-jerk standard calls for banning sex robots, but let's leave aside the politics for today and focus on the ethics. Is sex with robots a good thing, a bad thing, neither good nor bad, but some combination of them, and so forth? Now, the key contrast to robot sex is sex with an other actual human being. But one way to approach this is to see robot sex as part of a continuum of sexual practices that don't involve another actual human being. And that continuum, we can start with masturbation. So suppose you're by yourself and there's no other person, then obviously one masturbates, a kind of sexual experience. But let's follow the continuum starting with masturbation and add other elements and see if we can then identify a point of concern. First, the psychological element. So first baseline stage would be solo masturbation. Now next, stage 2, the person who is masturbating adds fantasies of a partner. There's not an actual partner, but the person imagines that they are interacting with another human being. So we've added a psychological element, fantasies. Next, third stage would be, in addition to fantasies, adding actual images of an attractive person, right? The person on computer or in a magazine is looking at images, and those images stimulate, right, the person sexually, and the person then is masturbating to those images. Suppose instead of simply still images, next, stage 4, we add video of an attractive person. So the person is masturbating while watching actually moving images of another person. Now, so far, we're adding increasingly realistic psychological elements to the solo sex experience. One is alone, but we go from fantasies to still images to moving images, all of which can stimulate us mentally. All right, now let's start the continuum again, but adding physical elements again along a continuum. So the baseline would be a person masturbating, touching himself or touching herself. But then the next step would be to introduce a sex toy, say a vibrator or a dildo or something like that. So masturbation while using a sex toy. So there's an increasing physical element externally that is added to the sex experience. Now, suppose next we substitute a past generation sex doll for the toy. Basically, those sex dolls were inflatable balloons or inflatable human-shaped toys, right? But that is an increasing physical stimulus that we add to the experience. Next, we would add a next generation sex robot for the doll, imagining that it is anatomically correct with very well simulated densities and textures in all of the right places and so forth. So we go from solo masturbation, touching oneself, to introducing a sex toy, introducing a past generation sex doll, now introducing a next generation sex robot. What if we go one step further and for the robot we substitute a prostitute? The prostitute is an actual human being with all of the correct physical parts and so on. Now, all of these things that we're adding are for the purpose of increasing the realism of both the physical and the psychological simulation. From the consumer's perspective, is there really much difference between a well-made sex robot and a prostitute? The physical sensations arguably would be the same, as are the psychological elements. The robot, through artificial intelligence, can be programmed to say whatever it is that you want, just as the prostitute is programmed usually by financial inducements to speak, to say the words, right, whatever it is that the consumer wants, right? You're so manly, right? You're the most beautiful woman in the world. Oh, I love it when you touch me like that. Oh, come here, you naughty boy, you need a spanking, and so forth. Now, those words come out of the sex robot's mouth. Those words come out of the prostitute's mouth. Both of them are artificially stimulated by the artificial intelligence or the financial inducements. And in both cases, the prostitute and the sex robot are pretty much physically identical. What's then the big problem here? Well, we would expect that the objections to sex robots, right, whatever they are, should then be similar to the objections to prostitution. And just as the arguments in favor of sex robots should be pretty similar to the arguments in favor of prostitution. Some differences, though, do, I think, make a difference here. In the long run, a sex robot is likely to be less expensive than frequenting prostitutes. Current prices seem to be, for a pretty high-functioning sex robot, anywhere in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. So depending on what prostitute price range you are interested in and how often you frequent a prostitute and how long the sex robot lasts, it could very well be that a sex robot is financially less expensive in the long run. So one interesting side issue would be that we might expect sex workers, prostitutes, to object to sex robots on economic grounds. The robots then will offer competition that's going to undercut the livelihood of the prostitutes. Another interesting sidebar is that robots are likely to be safer in a number of ways. They are less likely to transmit sexual diseases. They're less likely to bring customers into more dangerous parts of town, red light districts and so forth, and all of the accompanying physical dangers that go with street prostitution and red light districts. So we might expect that public health officials, government officers, vice squads, and so forth, that they will actively encourage sex robot production on public safety grounds. But that's a set of sidebars for another time. I want to focus here on the intensely personal aspects of sex and the values that are involved there, because it's those that robots highlight most. And these are really the core value concerns for most of us. Will the availability of high-tech sex robots further lessen the intimacy of couples? Right? Most of us know the challenges of maintaining intimacy over a long stretch of time. Will it be the case that the easy availability of high-tech sex robots means that one or both partners has sex with robots instead of each other, thus further undermining the intimacy of their relationship? Or will they cause more currently unattached people simply not to seek relationships at all, instead gaining most or all of their sexual satisfaction from the sex robots? So will the robots then mean that couples who are currently exerting effort to maintain the intimacy of their relationship, that becomes even more difficult, so we have more unsatisfied relationships existing? And or will we have just more individual people who don't engage in relationships at all? Instead, robots in this division of labor take over the sex part of our lives. And all of this, I think, takes us really to the core ethical issue, which is, what do we really want from sex?
In his book, Entrepreneurial Living, 15 Stories of Innovation, Risk and Achievement, and 1 Story of Abject Failure, Professor Stephen Hicks has put together a series of interviews with entrepreneurs from 6 different countries and 7 US states to explore the adventure and the hard-headedness of business. In this book, Hicks explores what makes for entrepreneurial success and failure. To what extent does success depend on the key decisions, ideas, persistent action, or character traits? How does one's business life fit into one's overall life? And how does one even define success? Our belief is that we can always learn from the accomplishments and setbacks of others. The life stories from others can be informative, cautionary, and inspirational, as we each strive to more fully realize our own potentials and achieve our own goals. The 16 entrepreneurs featured in this book are widespread geographically as well as in the range of their endeavors, from sports to education, to fashion to technology, to finance to advertising, to architecture, to cosmetics, and more. Observation of success and failure is often the best way to avoid pitfalls, learning from the mistakes of others to get on the pathway to success. This book doesn't disappoint, providing engaging and useful insights from the accounts of 16 entrepreneurs whose reflections are both personal to them and timeless in their significance for the rest of us. Pick up your copy of Entrepreneurial Living, 15 Stories of Innovation, Risk and Achievement, and 1 Story of Abject Failure by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, at its best, right, sex is an intensely physical experience and an intensely psychological experience. And the physical and the psychological are tightly integrated. You desire to have certain sensations, certain thoughts, certain emotions with another person. And you desire for that person simultaneously to have similar sensations, thoughts, and emotions with you. There's a deep mutuality and a deep integration of you and the other person, both physically and psychologically. The mutuality of sex at its best explains why some deviations from it are so disturbing. Right? So if, for example, your sexual partner just lies there and is disengaged, or your sex partner fakes an orgasm, or while you are interacting with the person sexually, you suspect or you know that the person is fantasizing about someone else, then you know in those circumstances that an absolutely important part of the experience is missing. Right? What's fundamental is that connection, that mutuality, both physically and psychologically, that's fundamental. The desire for mutuality, I think, then explains the core dissatisfaction with prostitution and sex robots. Right? At their very best, right, a prostitute or a sex robot can provide genuine physical sensations, but only simulated psychological experiences. Now, there's an interesting issue here. We do have a very powerful ability to suspend disbelief, to go into a fantasy world. Think, for example, when we're reading a book or we're watching a movie and it engages us. We know that the book is a simulation. We know the movie isn't real, but nonetheless, a good book and a good movie can sweep us into their virtuality or virtual reality, right, for a while. And that being swept into a virtual reality for a while can be a deeply satisfying experience. So, why couldn't that happen also with sex robots? Right? We can suspend disbelief, knowing in the lead up to the suspension of disbelief that we're not dealing with a real psychologically interacting with us being. It's only a simulated interacting that's going on, but nonetheless, once we get to that suspended disbelief point, the experience can have a great amount of satisfaction for us. It's also the case that we can compare real sex at its best with robot sex at its best. And of course, there's, I don't think, any real comparison. But we also should compare robot sex with real sex as it often actually is. And just as, pretty good sex with another person is still pretty good, perhaps robot sex can also be a pretty good second best option. What we shouldn't do then is to say compare real sex at its best with robot sex at its best and say since the one is better than the other, we need to be dismissive of the one that is the second best. Right? Often real sex is a second best option or a second best pretty good experience, and what we then should be doing is comparing something that might be pretty good on that level of evaluation. And what we also need to do, I think, is consider people who are in fairly unfortunate situations. Maybe sex at its very best is not possible for them temporarily or even permanently, and sex robots, good ones, can provide a genuine value to them. Consider, for example, those individuals who have severe physical deformities. Often those deformities make it difficult or even impossible for other people to consider them as sexual partners. So, what about their sexual life? Consider those who have been widowed. They still have sexual needs, sexual desires, but as widows still going through a process, they're not yet ready to seek another life partner, or even someone to share certain deep psychological intimacies yet. Consider those people who have psychological problems relating to intimacy, and for whom a sex robot could be a form of therapy. I'm reminded here of the movie Lars and the Real Girl, a very amusing and sensitive portrayal of a young man played by Ryan Gosling, who is socially alienated, has very difficult time interacting even with friends and members of the family and workplaces, much less actually ask a girl out and have a relationship with her. And he decides to introduce a sex doll into his life and to pretend that he has a relationship with him, and how his friends and family and workplace and general members of the community react to this and work with him on that is a very sensitively done story, so I recommend that movie. But the point is that there are people for whom a sex robot could be therapeutic. Consider also those people who have highly contagious sexually transmitted diseases. We don't want them to be threatening other people, and so perhaps a sex robot can be a substitute. But consider those people who have destructive sexual fantasies. They want to rape, they want to damage, they want to do various harmful things in a sexual context to other people. They're trying to control their fantasies, but it's possible for them to find some catharsis or release, right, with a sex robot. Or Or consider more casually those people who just want to get laid on Saturday night, but their usual strategy is a kind of predatory strategy. They go up to the bars, they pretend to be interested in someone so as to get sex, but then they just use the other person and then they forget the person, and there are the hard feelings that often follow from that. Consider couples who have occasional fantasies about introducing a third person into their sexual life, but at the same time they fear the harm that jealousy could do to their genuine relationship. So, it strikes me that sex robots could be beneficial in all such circumstances and be adding genuinely positive values to people's lives, and perhaps avoiding damage that comes from certain sorts of sexuality from being introduced and furthered. But while sex robots could be beneficial in circumstances like the ones listed, I think it's also true that robots could tempt many people not to seek the best, right, when it is in fact possible to them. One danger we all face is to compromise where we don't really need to compromise, or out of laziness settle for second or third best when in fact something that is much better is available to us. Can sex robots be a source of temptation in that area? So, think about the self-doubts that we all have, for example. My various physical parts are too large or too small or too firm or too soft, and so I worry about my physicality, particularly when I am naked and exposed with another person. Or I doubt my ability to woo someone and to get a yes answer when I make a sexual advance. So I worry about I might be rejected when I make a sexual advance, and that's going to hurt my feelings. So why not play it safe and go for the sure thing with the sex robot? We also have the potential for laziness. Relationships are very time-consuming, effort-consuming, sometimes expensive. So why not settle for the easier sex robot option? Why go out to the bar and spend a lot of money in 3 hours trying to get someone, and maybe I won't get laid that night? Why not go for the easier sex robot? Why not ask out that attractive woman that I saw? It might not lead anywhere. Why not just go for the sure thing that is the sex robot? We might be comfortable with ourselves and we might want to make the effort, but also the possibility is that we fear our partner, right, will settle for the virtual sex. And that raises another kind of fear. Can I compete with a physically perfect specimen? We can order sex robots to have any part in any dimension and any coloring that we want. And how can I compete with that? But notice that these kinds of concerns are as old as man and woman. The development and introduction of sex robots doesn't change the same things that we all struggle with in our sexual lives: our self-doubts, our fears, costs, efforts, desire for genuine intimacy. Every generation has its doubts, its fears, and its worries. This development of robots doesn't change those dynamics. What the robots do, I think, is make clearer what we really want from sex, what we genuinely need from sex, and to give us all really just more options in our sexual lives. Real intimacy between two human beings, that's what sex at its best is about. That's still as valuable as it always has been. We all want the real deal, a response from another human being that is appreciative of who we really are, and a response that enables us, and an experience that enables us to be appreciative of who our partner really is. No robot can replace what only you can offer to another person, and that is you being you. And no robot can replace what only another actual person can give to you, which is genuine intimacy with his or her uniqueness. That's the experience that we want. But for those for whom real intimacy is not currently an option, right? The widowed, those struggling with physical and psychological disabilities, and so on. Why not have available sex robots that can nonetheless offer some other genuine sex-related values? Sex robots are a tool, and like any tool, they can be used to help us achieve genuine values. And of course, like any tool, they can be misused or abused. We have the exact same argument about every new piece of technology that comes along, and the response to potential misuses is education and character development, not knee-jerk fears and attempts to abolish the phenomenon.
The host of the Open College podcast, Dr. Stephen Hicks, is a renowned philosopher and author. His field of study and insights into postmodernism explain how it has become one of the most powerful intellectual movements of our time, and what that actually means. If you'd like to access more information from Dr. Hicks himself, then check out his website at www.stephenhicks.org. You'll be able to find details on his latest publications, courses, and philosophical information concerning business ethics, education, intellectual history, and religion. To stay up to date with the latest from Stephen Hicks himself, make sure you've subscribed to the Open College Podcast feed and follow at Open College Podcast on all your favourite social networks. And while you're online, please leave the show a review on iTunes and Stitcher.